Imagine police showing up at your home because of a harmless flag. Then imagine their faces when they discover the suspect's husband is one of their own. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and louder than a casual visitor would ever knock. 3 heavy thuds rattled the wooden frame of the front door, the kind that makes you stop whatever you're doing because you know something serious is happening. Inside the neat 2-story home on a quiet street in Tempe, Arizona, 42-year-old Danielle Morton froze in place, a dish towel still in her hand. She wasn't expecting anyone. The neighbors usually rang the bell or texted first, and her husband hadn't mentioned inviting anyone over. She wiped her hands against the towel, took a breath, and walked toward the door. From the narrow glass panel on the side, she saw the unmistakable sight of 2 uniformed police officers standing tall, one resting his hand casually near his belt. Her first thought wasn't fear, but confusion. Why would police be at her door in the middle of the afternoon? Danielle pulled the door open just enough to step into the frame. "Good afternoon, officers," she said slowly, keeping her tone polite. "Can I help you with something?" The taller of the 2, Officer Grant, adjusted his cap before answering. "Ma'am, we received a call from your homeowners association. They reported a violation and a possible confrontation. We just need to ask you a few questions." Danielle's brow furrowed. "A confrontation? With who?" "I've been home all day." The second officer, younger and less composed, shifted uncomfortably. "They said you refused to comply with HOA rules regarding decorations on your property." Danielle let out a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She stepped aside slightly so they could see what they were talking about. Hanging neatly from a pole beside her porch was a bright sunflower flag, a simple, cheerful design she'd bought at a local craft store to celebrate spring. Nothing political, nothing controversial, just sunflowers. "You're here? Because of that?" she asked, pointing to the fabric swaying in the breeze. Neither officer answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough that Danielle began to feel a pit forming in her stomach. She crossed her arms. "So, let me understand this correctly," she said firmly. "The HOA called the police on me." Over a flag with flowers, Grant cleared his throat. "We're just here to follow up. They claimed you were aggressive when contacted before." Danielle blinked. "Aggressive? Nobody from the HOA has even knocked on my door. I got a letter, sure, but no one's spoken to me face to face." At that moment, the younger officer seemed to realize how flimsy the situation sounded. He shifted again, looking down at his notepad, almost embarrassed to be there. Danielle took a step forward. "Officers, do I look like I'm causing a disturbance? I'm cooking dinner, in my own home, minding my business. This doesn't make any sense." Her voice was calm, but steady enough to remind them that she was fully aware of her rights. The officers exchanged a glance, the kind of silent communication that says, "This is not what we expected." Then, before either of them could respond, heavy footsteps echoed behind Danielle. Her husband, Lieutenant Anthony Morton, had just come in from the garage. He still wore his dark blue police uniform, his badge shining on his chest, and his radio clipped at his side. He'd ended his shift less than an hour ago, but hadn't changed yet. "What's going on?" Anthony asked, stepping into view. His voice carried authority, the natural command of someone used to giving orders in high-stakes situations. The 2 officers' faces shifted instantly. Their shoulders straightened, and the confidence they carried at the door cracked. "Lieutenant Morton?" Officer Grant asked carefully, suddenly unsure of himself. Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Yes. And you are?" "Grant, sir. Tempe PD. We received a call from the HOA. Said there was an issue here." Anthony looked from the officers to his wife, then back again. "An issue? With a spring flag? That's what this is about?" Grant swallowed hard. "That's what we were told, sir." Anthony let out a slow breath and crossed his arms over his chest. His posture alone shifted the entire balance of the encounter. "So let me get..." But Danielle knew this wasn't really about the flag, and deep down, both officers knew it too. But this confrontation was just the surface. The story had started days earlier, with a letter that seemed minor at first but carried far more weight than it should have. 3 days earlier, Danielle had come home from a long shift at the community health center where she worked as an intake coordinator. She remembered juggling grocery bags as she walked up her driveway, only to notice a white envelope tucked awkwardly into the side of her mailbox. The return address said it all. East Ridge Homeowners Association. She sighed before even opening it. HOA mail never carried good news. Either it was a reminder about dues or some nitpicky complaint. Danielle tucked the envelope under her arm, carried the groceries inside, and set them down on the kitchen counter. Only after she poured herself a glass of water did she rip it open. The letter was typed, sterile, and signed at the bottom by Gerald Whitman, the HOA president. Danielle read it twice, making sure she wasn't misinterpreting it. This notice serves as an official warning. Your property has been found in violation of community guidelines due to unauthorized modifications to exterior decor. Failure to comply may result in fines or further action. She tilted her head, confused. Unauthorized modifications? What were they even talking about? Danielle walked back outside, scanning her front porch like she was trying to spot something she had missed. The potted plants were neatly arranged. The small bench near the steps was the same one she'd had for years. The only new addition was the flag. A cheerful sunflower design, bright yellows and greens waving gently in the warm Arizona breeze. Really? Danielle muttered to herself. This? This is what they're upset about? When Anthony came home later that evening, she handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his brow tightening. They can't be serious, he said. A sunflower flag isn't against any rule I've ever read. Did you look at the handbook? Danielle nodded. I checked. It says flags are allowed as long as they're not offensive or political. How is a sunflower offensive? Anthony smirked. Only if you hate summer. They both laughed, but Danielle's laughter faded quicker than her husband's. Something about the letter felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just the complaint. It was the tone. Cold. Almost accusatory. As if she had done something deliberate to disrespect the neighborhood. She knew her HOA president by name. Gerald Whitman was an older man, retired, who spent more time patrolling the neighborhood in his golf cart than anyone else spent outside. He'd been known to measure people's lawns with a ruler, reporting even half an inch of overgrowth as a violation. And while most neighbors tolerated his antics, Danielle always felt like his eyes lingered a little longer on her house. That evening, she called her friend Tricia Owens, who lived 2 streets over. Did you get a letter from the HOA about porch decor? She asked. Tricia chuckled. No? Why? Danielle explained the situation and Tricia groaned in frustration. Girl, they've been targeting people one by one. Last month, they told a family down the street their welcome mat was too distracting. A welcome mat. Gerald thrives on this stuff, Danielle rubbed her temple. So what do I do? Take it down? I don't want to fight. Don't take it down. Tricia replied firmly. That's what they want. They'll keep pushing until you give in. Danielle stayed quiet for a moment, staring at the flag outside her window. She thought about her kids, both teenagers, who had already started noticing the small differences in how their family was treated compared to others. She wanted to set an example, to show them you didn't have to cave just because someone in a position of authority tried to intimidate you. The next morning, she left the flag right where it was. A day later, Danielle saw Gerald himself ride by in his golf cart. He slowed to a crawl in front of her house, squinting at the porch like he was cataloguing evidence. Danielle stood on the porch, arms crossed, making sure he saw her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Gerald's lips pressed into a thin line, and then he rolled forward without a word. By the time Danielle got home that afternoon, a second letter had been taped directly to her door. The wording was sharper this time. Final notice. Anthony paused, considering her words. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Then we'll cross that bridge if it comes. But Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a flag. It was about control, about reminding her that no matter how perfect her lawn looked, or how much she contributed to the community, some people would always see her family as outsiders. She kept the flag up, but every time she walked past the front window, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that someone was waiting for her to slip. But while Danielle tried to stand her ground, Gerald Whitman and the HOA board were already drafting their next move, one that would escalate everything beyond reason. On the evening that Danielle received the second notice, another meeting was taking place just a few blocks away, in a large stucco home at the end of the cul-de-sac. The living room of Gerald Whitman had become an unofficial headquarters for the HOA board. It wasn't on the calendar, no official record, just a handful of neighbors gathered around his glass coffee table, sipping iced tea while Gerald shuffled through copies of Danielle's violation letters. "Look," Gerald said, waving the paper in the air. "She's ignored 2 written notices. That's not just negligence, that's outright defiance. If we let this slide, we set a precedent. Next thing you know, people will be hanging all sorts of flags. Sports teams, slogans, you name it." Marjorie Klein, one of the longest tenured board members, leaned forward. "Gerald, it's a sunflower, not a protest banner." "I don't see the harm." Gerald's face tightened. "That's not the point. The rules are the rules, and if we let her bend them, others will follow." Another board member, Richard Hale, nodded in agreement. "We've got to maintain order. That neighborhood handbook was written for a reason. I say we escalate." The room grew tense. Marjorie tapped her fingers against the armrest. "Escalate how? A fine? Another warning?" Gerald shook his head. "No, she's ignoring us deliberately. That's grounds for involving local authorities. A call to the police will send a message, not just to her, but to anyone else thinking they can pick and choose which rules to follow." Marjorie's eyes widened. "The police? Over a flag? You'll make this whole board look ridiculous." Gerald's lips curved into a thin smile. "Not if we word it correctly. We report that she became hostile. We stress the disturbance factor. That way, it's not just about the flag. It's about community safety." Richard adjusted in his chair, lowering his voice as though even the walls might judge him. "You're saying we exaggerate?" "I'm saying," Gerald replied carefully, "we frame it in a way that gets action. Otherwise, we're wasting our time." For a long moment, no one spoke. The whir of the ceiling fan filled the silence. Then Richard leaned back with a sigh. "Fine. But if this backfires, I want no part of it." Marjorie crossed her arms, disapproving. "You're playing with fire, Gerald. People already think you target certain families." "This will only make that worse." Gerald waved her off. "Rules are colorblind. If she can't follow them, that's on her." But in truth, his frustration had very little to do with sunflowers or flags. Gerald had never liked the Mortons moving into the neighborhood in the first place. He masked his bias behind the shield of bylaws and regulations, but his scrutiny of their home had been relentless from the beginning. Later that night, Gerald typed up a formal complaint to the local police department. He described Danielle as confrontational and uncooperative, claiming she had refused to comply after multiple requests. He stressed the possibility of a disturbance escalating. The report was carefully crafted to sound like more than a petty flag dispute. By the time Gerald hit send, the matter had already left his hands. The next morning, Danielle sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee, unaware that her family had been placed on the radar of the local police. Her teenage daughter, Kira, walked in carrying her backpack. "Mom, did you take down the flag?" she asked, glancing at the porch. "No," Danielle answered firmly. "And I'm not going to. It's just flowers, Kira. We're not doing anything wrong." Kira frowned. "I heard some kids at school saying their parents don't like us because of it." Danielle's heart sank. She set her mug down and reached across the table. "Listen to me. People will always find reasons to complain. That doesn't mean we have to bend every time. What matters is that we know we're in the right." Kira nodded, but her face carried the uncertainty only a teenager could wear when they realized how unfair the world could be. Later that afternoon, Gerald sent a quick email to the other board members. "Filed the report. Authorities should follow up soon," Richard responded within minutes. The call went out from dispatch just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It wasn't coded as urgent, not a robbery or a fight, but the wording was enough to catch the attention of the 2 officers cruising near downtown Tempe. "Possible domestic disturbance," the dispatcher said flatly over the radio. "Report filed by Homeowners Association. Alleged hostile resident refusing compliance with community standards." Officer Ethan Grant, the senior of the 2, reached for the receiver. "Copy that. We'll check it out." Beside him, his partner, Officer Noah Delgado, younger and still carrying the newness of a fresh academy graduate, frowned. Community standards? That sounds like HOA nonsense. Grant shrugged. Maybe. But the report says hostile. We don't get to pick and choose. We show up, we assess, we write it down. That's the job. The cruiser turned onto wide residential streets lined with palm trees and manicured lawns. As they drove, Noah flipped through the notes on his tablet. Resident's name is Danielle Morton. Married. No criminal record. Works at the health center. Doesn't look like trouble, Grant grunted. Doesn't matter. People look fine until they don't. We go by the report. But even as he said it, Grant felt the tug of skepticism. In his years on the job, he had answered plenty of HOA-initiated calls. Most were petty. Trash cans left out too long, a barking dog, teenagers on skateboards. Almost all of them ended the same way. Frustrated residents on one side and embarrassed officers on the other. Still, the word hostile lingered. It meant paperwork. And paperwork meant justification. Meanwhile, inside the Morton home, Danielle had no idea officers were already heading her way. She was in the kitchen prepping vegetables for dinner, humming lightly as she thought about how nice it would be to spend a quiet evening with Anthony. The sunflower flag caught her eye from the window, bright and harmless. She wondered, not for the first time, how anyone could see it as threatening. Her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from the HOA. The subject line read, "Notice of report to authorities." Danielle stared at it, stunned. She clicked it open and scanned the short, clipped sentences. Due to non-compliance and hostile behavior, this matter has been escalated to local authorities. Expect follow-up. She read it twice before setting the phone down slowly. Hostile behavior? She whispered to herself. I haven't even spoken to them. Her stomach tightened. She thought about her kids. About Anthony. About what it would mean if officers showed up believing lies. Out on the road, Grant and Delgado turned onto East Ridge Lane. The houses here were uniform. Tan walls, red-tiled roofs, each yard trimmed as though competing for a magazine cover. Noah glanced at the numbers until he spotted the Mortons' address. That's the one, he said. Grant slowed the cruiser. All right, standard approach. Keep it calm. Let's see what this is about. They parked in front of the house. The sunflower flag was immediately visible, waving cheerfully in the warm breeze. Noah frowned at it. That's it? That's what we're here for? Grant shook his head. Don't assume. Just follow the process. Both officers stepped out, their boots crunching lightly against the pavement. Grant straightened his vest, while Noah adjusted his duty belt nervously. The front yard was spotless, the kind of neatness that usually signaled a homeowner who cared about appearances. From across the street, an elderly neighbor peeked through her blinds, eyes fixed on the patrol car. Within seconds, 2 more heads appeared at windows. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like this. Danielle, still in the kitchen, noticed the blue and white cruiser pull up outside. Her breath caught. She grabbed a towel to wipe her hands, her heart already pounding. Kira, walking down the stairs with her phone in hand, glanced out the window. Mom, the cops are here. Danielle closed her eyes briefly before answering. All right, I'll talk to them. She squared her shoulders, forcing calm into her body. Inside, her nerves rattled, but outwardly she needed to project control. She knew too well how perception could shape outcomes. On the porch, Grant lifted his hand and knocked hard on the door. Noah stood slightly behind him, hand resting near his belt but not on his holster. The knock echoed through the house. Danielle walked to the door, glanced once through the side panel, and exhaled slowly. 2 officers. Serious faces. She opened the door, her voice steady. Good. Noah glanced at the sunflower flag and then back at Danielle, his expression uncertain. He whispered low enough for Grant to catch it. This doesn't look hostile. Grant ignored the comment, keeping his face professional. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Danielle crossed her arms, her voice calm but firm. You can ask. But you should know. This is harassment. They've been writing me up for a sunflower flag. That's all this is. For the first time, Grant's confidence wavered. He looked at the flag, then back at Danielle. The pieces didn't quite fit the way the report had painted them. Still, his training told him to remain neutral. Before he could respond, heavy footsteps came from inside the house. Anthony had just walked in from the garage, still in his police uniform. His badge caught the sunlight as he stepped into the doorway. "What's going on here?" Anthony asked, his voice carrying authority. The two officers froze, realization dawning on their faces. They hadn't been told they were walking into the home of a fellow officer. Grant stiffened. "Lieutenant Morton?" Anthony's eyes narrowed. "Yes." "And you are?" But in that instant, the entire encounter shifted, and the balance of power at the door swung sharply away from the HOA's narrative. Anthony's sudden appearance in full uniform shifted the air like a gust of wind through a closed room. The two officers straightened instinctively, their eyes darting from the badge on his chest to the calm but firm expression on his face. Danielle stood beside him, her arms folded, not angry, but undeniably tired of the absurdity that had been dropped on her doorstep. "Lieutenant Morton," Grant said, his voice noticeably more careful now. "We didn't realize this was your residence." Anthony's gaze stayed steady. "Clearly. Otherwise, I doubt you'd be here on something this ridiculous. So, tell me, why are you standing at my door, questioning my wife about a flag with sunflowers?" Noah shifted uncomfortably. His youth betrayed him as he glanced back at the fluttering fabric, almost embarrassed by its innocence. Grant, more experienced, cleared his throat. "We responded to a report filed by the Homeowners Association. They claimed Mrs. Morton was hostile when asked to remove it." Danielle stepped forward, her voice cutting in before Anthony could. "That's a lie. No one has knocked on my door, no one has called me, no one has even spoken to me in person. I've only gotten letters taped to my door and stuffed into my mailbox. If they're calling that hostility, then they're inventing things to get their way." Anthony looked at her, then back at the officers. "And you came here prepared for what? A dangerous situation? Because that's how this reads." Grant's lips tightened. He was trained to keep his tone neutral, but there was no hiding the discomfort in his eyes. "We were told the situation could escalate. We had to follow up." Danielle laughed, though it was sharp and short. "Escalate? To what? Me watering my plants too aggressively? This is absurd." Anthony placed a hand on her arm lightly, not to stop her, but to show support. "She's right. This is an abuse of your time, and frankly, of your authority. My wife is being targeted by a group of people who think they can weaponize the police to do their dirty work." Noah finally spoke up, his voice cautious but honest. "With respect, sir, it doesn't look like there's a problem here. The report we were given doesn't match what we're seeing." Danielle turned to him, her expression softening just slightly. "Thank you. That's because there is no problem. There never was. This was their attempt to intimidate me." Across the street, blinds shifted again. A neighbor, bold enough to open their front door, stepped onto their porch, pretending to adjust a flower pot while openly staring. Danielle noticed, her jaw tightening. She knew the gossip mill was already spinning. Anthony straightened, his tone low but edged with authority. "Officers, I appreciate you doing your job, but let's be clear. This was a waste of your time and mine. A sunflower flag is not a violation of state law, and it's certainly not grounds for labeling my wife hostile." Grant gave a curt nod. "Understood, sir. We'll note the discrepancy in our report." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "And what about the HOA? Do they face any consequences for filing false reports, or do they just get to keep using you as muscle every time they want to bully someone?" That question hung heavier than the silence that followed. Grant didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. The truth was, officers responded to what was filed. Whether it was exaggerated or baseless, once the call was made, they were bound to show up. Noah broke the silence again, almost cautiously. "Ma'am, if it helps, I'll make a note in the system. If another call comes from the same source, it'll be flagged differently." Danielle exhaled slowly. "I appreciate that." Anthony stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway. "Officers, unless you have a lawful reason to be here, this conversation is over. You've seen for yourselves what's happening." Grant nodded stiffly. "We'll log it." "Good evening, Lieutenant." The police cruiser was barely out of sight before Danielle shut the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment. Her hands were steady on the outside, but inside, her heart hadn't stopped thudding since the first knock. Anthony stood next to her, still in full uniform, his cap tucked under his arm. "That could have gone differently," Danielle whispered. Anthony looked at her carefully. "It would have gone differently if I hadn't walked in when I did. You know that, don't you?" She swallowed hard. "That's what scares me." Anthony walked further into the living room and dropped into the armchair, exhaling. His presence filled the space, but tonight his badge felt heavier than usual. Danielle sat on the edge of the couch across from him. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner kicking on. Kira hovered by the stairs, her face tense. "Mum, are you okay?" Danielle forced a smile for her daughter's sake. "I'm fine, baby. Go finish your homework." But Kira didn't move. Her eyes flicked between her parents. "They really came here, over a flag?" Anthony answered before Danielle could. "Yes. And they'll think twice before doing it again." His tone was confident, but Danielle heard the undercurrent of frustration beneath it. Kira finally trudged upstairs, muttering under her breath, "This neighborhood is ridiculous." Anthony rubbed the bridge of his nose. They knew exactly what they were doing when they made that call. Words like hostile are not accidental. They wanted a reaction. They wanted officers to show up primed for conflict. Danielle looked at him sharply. "And if you hadn't been home, if you weren't in that uniform, what would have happened? Would they have believed me when I told them it was just a sunflower flag?" Anthony didn't answer right away. His silence said more than words could. Across the street, Gerald Whitman sat on his porch pretending to read the newspaper. In reality, he'd watched the entire encounter. From his seat, he saw the cruiser, the conversation, and finally, Anthony stepping into the doorway in his uniform. Gerald's lips tightened into a line. This wasn't how he imagined it playing out. He wanted Danielle cornered, forced to comply under pressure. Instead, she'd stood her ground. And worse, her husband had tilted the balance completely. Gerald folded his paper and walked back inside, already thinking of how he'd spin the story to the rest of the board. Back in the Morton household, Danielle stood and paced the living room. "Anthony, I've dealt with nitpicking before. Letters about trash bins, reminders about lawn care. But this was different. They tried to paint me as some kind of threat in my own home." Anthony nodded. "It's a tactic. You escalate the language, you shape the narrative. That way, by the time the cops arrive, they've already got an image of you in their heads. Aggressive, hostile, uncooperative. You don't even get the benefit of the doubt." Danielle sat back down, her voice quieter now. "I didn't do anything wrong, and still, I had to explain myself like a suspect." Anthony leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "That's exactly why I'm glad I walked out when I did. The moment they saw my badge, the story flipped. Their whole posture changed. But that shouldn't be what it takes." Danielle met his eyes. "And what about the next family, Anthony? The ones who don't have you standing in the doorway in uniform. What happens when the HOA calls the cops on them?" Anthony sighed, running a hand over his cropped hair. "That's the part I can't shake. I've been on the other side of those calls. I know how quickly things can spiral when officers come in expecting hostility." Outside, another car slowed in front of their home. A neighbor, phone in hand, craned her neck to get a better look at the porch. Danielle's shoulders tightened. She knew by tomorrow, The following evening, the Mortons decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for them. Danielle loved the warm Arizona evenings when the sun dipped low, but the air still carried a gentle heat. Anthony walked beside her, still in plain clothes this time, holding the leash of their dog, a golden retriever named Jasper. But the street didn't feel the same anymore. Heads turned as they passed. Conversations dropped to hushed tones. Curtains twitched open just enough to catch a glimpse of them. Danielle kept her chin high, but she felt the weight of every stare. When they reached the end of the block, a familiar voice called out, "Evening, Danielle!" Anthony. It was Trisha Owens, her friend from a few streets over. Trisha walked quickly to catch up, her face full of concern. "Girl, I heard what happened. Is it true? Did the HOA really call the cops on you?" Danielle exhaled. "Yes, over that flag. They told the police I was hostile." Trisha shook her head. "Unbelievable. Gerald's gone too far this time. People are already talking about it. Some of them think you must have done something to deserve it." Anthony raised an eyebrow. And what exactly is hostile about a sunflower? Tricia gave a tired laugh. You'd be surprised what people can convince themselves of when they want a reason to complain. As they talked, another neighbor approached. Howard Green, a man in his 60s who often prided himself on keeping the tidiest yard on the street, slowed to a stop. Evening, he said, though his tone was stiff. His eyes moved from Danielle to Anthony. I saw the police at your place yesterday. Danielle nodded. Yes. They came because the HOA made a false report. Howard's lips pressed into a thin line. Well, rules are rules. The HOA just wants what's best for the community. Anthony turned, his voice calm but edged with steel. Howard, there's nothing in the rules that says a sunflower flag violates anything. I've read the handbook cover to cover. What they filed wasn't about community. It was about intimidation. Howard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Anthony's gaze. I'm just saying. People notice when someone pushes back. That's all. With that, he gave a stiff nod and walked away. Danielle's jaw tightened. That right there is the problem. People would rather side with Gerald than admit something's wrong, Tricia sighed. And they'll talk about it like you're the one causing trouble. They continued walking, but it was clear word had spread beyond whispers. By the time they circled back toward their house, Gerald himself was standing at the edge of his driveway, leaning on his golf cart. His eyes tracked them like a hawk watching prey. Anthony's grip on Jasper's leash tightened, but Danielle placed a hand on his arm. Don't, she said softly. That's what he wants. Still, Gerald made the first move. Evening, Lieutenant, he said with false politeness, his voice carrying across the lawn. Quite the scene yesterday, wasn't it? I hope there are no hard feelings. Anthony stopped, turning to face him. Hard feelings? You called the police on my wife with a fabricated story. You put officers in an impossible position. You put my family in an impossible position. And now you're standing here pretending it was nothing. Gerald spread his hands, feigning innocence. We had to enforce the rules. Mrs. Morton refused to comply. That's all it was. Danielle stepped forward. No, Gerald. That's not all it was. You lied. You said I was hostile. You painted me as a threat in my own home, and you thought no one would question it. For the first time, Gerald's face twitched. He hadn't expected Danielle to meet him head-on. Now let's not exaggerate. Exaggerate? Anthony cut in. His voice was calm, but sharp enough to slice through the tension. Do you realize what could have happened if I hadn't been here? If officers came in expecting hostility, things could have escalated. Fast. Do you understand the risk you created? Gerald shifted uncomfortably, the swagger draining from his stance. He cleared his throat, muttered something about miscommunication, and backed toward his driveway. Danielle didn't move, her eyes locked on him. You don't get to hide behind that word. You tried to intimidate me, and it didn't work. So let me make this clear. I'm not taking the flag down, and I won't be bullied. For a long second, by the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Danielle didn't need to scroll through the neighborhood Facebook group to know it. She could feel it in the air. Walking Jasper along the block, she caught the half-smiles, the stiff greetings, and the pointed glances at her porch. The sunflower flag had gone from cheerful decoration to silent protest, fluttering as if it knew it carried a weight no piece of fabric should bear. Anthony drove to his precinct early, but not before warning her. If anyone approaches you, keep calm. Don't give them what they're looking for. They want a reaction. Danielle nodded, but inside she braced herself. Because in her gut she knew Anthony was right. Gerald wouldn't let it drop, and neither would his allies. Sure enough, later that afternoon, Danielle was sweeping her porch when she heard voices drifting from across the street. Two neighbors, Howard Green and Evelyn Marsh, were standing near the curb in animated conversation. They weren't whispering. They wanted to be heard. I just don't understand why she can't follow the rules like everyone else, Evelyn said, clutching her phone tightly. It's not about the flag. It's about respect for the community. Howard nodded solemnly. Exactly. If the board lets her get away with it, what's next? Everyone doing whatever they want? We bought here for order, not chaos. Danielle's broom slowed, her jaw tightening. They spoke as if she weren't 10 feet away, as if she were invisible. Before she could respond, another voice joined in. It was Patricia Gomez, a younger neighbor with 2 small kids, who walked over carrying a stroller. "Order?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Howard, it's a sunflower flag. I've seen you leave your garbage bins out for 3 days straight, and nobody called the cops on you." Howard flushed. "That's different." "No, it's not," Patricia shot back. "This isn't about rules. This is about control." Danielle felt a flicker of gratitude, but she stayed silent, letting Patricia carry the weight of the argument. Evelyn crossed her arms, lowering her voice just slightly. "Well, if you ask me, she brought it on herself. Defying the HOA doesn't end well. Everyone knows that Patricia let out a sharp laugh. Or maybe the HOA brought it on themselves. Maybe some people need to learn they can't police everything they don't like." The tension hung heavy until Evelyn and Howard muttered excuses and walked off. Patricia turned to Danielle with a sympathetic smile. "Ignore them. You're not wrong here, and some of us see exactly what's going on." "Thank you," Danielle said softly. "But I don't think ignoring them is going to be enough anymore." That night, the division became even clearer. The neighborhood Facebook group lit up with posts. Some defended Danielle outright, pointing out how ridiculous it was to involve police over a flag. Others parroted Gerald's line that she was disrespectful and defiant. A few posts stopped just short of outright hostility, hinting at her being different and not fitting in. Anthony scrolled through the comments when he got home, shaking his head. This is exactly what Gerald wanted. He didn't just call the cops on you. He set the stage to pit the whole neighborhood against itself. Danielle leaned against the arm of the couch, her voice low but steady. Then maybe it's time to stop being quiet. They're using words like hostile to describe me when I've done nothing. Maybe it's time I start speaking for myself before they finish writing the story without me. Anthony looked at her carefully. You want to go public? She nodded. I'll write my own post. Not defensive, not angry, just the truth. People need to hear it from me, not through Gerald's spin. That evening, Danielle sat at her laptop and began to type. Her fingers flew across the keys, steady but deliberate. To our neighbors, some of you may have seen police at our home yesterday. I want to set the record straight. They were called because of a sunflower flag on our porch. The HOA reported me as hostile, even though no one ever spoke to me. The officers came. They saw. Danielle didn't sleep much that night. Every time she rolled over, her mind drifted back to the glowing screen of her laptop, the post she had written, and the flood of responses it triggered. By morning, her phone was buzzing with notifications. Some messages were private, neighbors thanking her for speaking out, admitting they'd been too afraid to challenge the HOA. Others were less kind, accusing her of being dramatic or divisive. Anthony sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, scrolling through the thread on his phone. You should see this, he said, sliding it across the table toward her. Danielle glanced down at the screen. A new comment from someone she didn't even know read, Why call the police over flowers? Makes me wonder how many times this happens and no one ever hears about it. She exhaled slowly. That's exactly the point. Anthony nodded. You put a spotlight on it. Gerald thought he could twist the story in the shadows. Now everyone sees what really happened. Their teenage son, Marcus Jr., shuffled into the kitchen, yawning. He opened the fridge, grabbed a juice box, and plopped down at the counter. Mom, people at school were talking about you yesterday, he said between sips. Someone's mom posted that the police had to calm you down, but then another kid showed me your post, and it was totally different. Everyone was arguing about it. Danielle rubbed her temple. Great. So now it's not just the neighborhood, it's the whole school. Anthony leaned back in his chair. That's how misinformation works. One exaggerated report and suddenly you're the villain. But your post is changing that. Danielle stared at the sunflower flag swaying outside. It looked different to her now. No longer just a splash of color. It was a battle line. I never wanted to be in a fight with my neighbors, she said softly. I just wanted to live in peace. But when they called the cops on me, it stopped being about peace. It became about principle. Anthony reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. You did the right thing. You didn't yell. You didn't stoop to their level. You told the truth. She squeezed his hand back, but stayed quiet. Inside, she wrestled with the same thought she had spoken the night before. What if he hadn't been home? The image replayed in her mind. 2 officers standing at her door, primed by Gerald's words to expect hostility. If Anthony hadn't stepped out in uniform, would her calm explanation have been enough? Or would the sight of her alone, black and defiant, have tilted the balance in another direction? Later that day, Danielle stepped outside to water her plants. Patricia Gomez walked by with her kids, stopping briefly at the sidewalk. "Your post was brave," Patricia said. "You said what a lot of us wanted to say, but didn't dare." Danielle gave a tired smile. "Brave or foolish? Time will tell," Patricia shook her head. "No, Gerald's power comes from silence. You broke that. People are watching now, and some of them are rooting for you, even if they don't say it out loud." As Patricia walked on, Danielle caught sight of Gerald driving past in his golf cart, his face tight with irritation. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. His glare said everything. The war was far from over. That evening, Anthony came home late, his expression heavy. He tossed his keys on the counter. "People at the precinct heard about it too," he said. "One of the guys asked me why the HOA would call over something so petty. Another joked about how many sunflower flags were going to start popping up around the city now." Danielle chuckled despite herself. "Maybe they'll start a movement." Anthony's smile was brief, but it faded quickly. He sat across from her, his voice low. "You know, this could have gone another way. Officers are trained to control situations, not always to listen. If they'd come here already convinced you were a threat..." I don't even want to finish that sentence. Danielle's eyes welled slightly, though she blinked the tears back. "That's what I keep thinking about. There are families who don't have someone in uniform standing behind them. What happens to them when the HOA decides to call the cops over something?" They sat in silence, listening to the faint rustle of the flag outside the window. It had become more than fabric. It was now a reminder that standing firm wasn't just about personal pride. It was about survival, justice, and dignity. But while Danielle and Anthony reflected on the lesson, Gerald and the HOA were already regrouping, desperate to reclaim control of a neighborhood now divided. 2 days passed before Danielle heard from the HOA again. This time there was no letter taped to her door, no envelope in the mailbox. Instead, an email arrived in her inbox with the subject line, "Reminder of Community Harmony." She clicked it open, already bracing herself. The message was short, written in Gerald's clipped formal style. "As residents of East Ridge, it is important we all strive for unity. Recent events have drawn unnecessary attention to our community. We encourage all members to cooperate with HOA guidelines to avoid further incidents." Danielle read it twice, then pushed her chair back from the table. She didn't bother showing it to Anthony. He'd already guessed Gerald would try to reframe the story. To Gerald, this wasn't about sunflowers or rules anymore. It was about saving face. That evening, as the family ate dinner, Anthony finally said what had been on both their minds. "This isn't just about us anymore. The HOA knows they lost control the second you went public, and now they're trying to scare you back into silence." Danielle rested her fork down. "I'm not going quiet. If anything, this made me realize just how many people never speak up at all. How many families just pay fines, take things down, or move away because they're too tired to fight." Kira, listening from her spot at the table, asked softly, "Mom, does that mean we're gonna move too?" Danielle shook her head. "No, baby. That's what they want. We belong here just like anyone else." The words hung in the room, heavy but grounding. For Danielle, they weren't just meant for her daughter. They were a reminder to herself. Later that night, she sat alone on the porch, the sunflower flag catching the evening breeze. Patricia walked by with her stroller, offering a small wave. A few houses down, Howard avoided eye contact while watering his lawn. Danielle could see the invisible line running through the street now. Those who supported her, those who sided with Gerald, and those too afraid to pick either side. Anthony stepped outside and joined her, sitting on the porch steps. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen officers called to houses for reasons just as small as this. Sometimes it ends with a conversation. Other times," he trailed off. shaking his head. Danielle looked at him. But this time it ended differently. Because you walked out in uniform? Anthony's jaw tightened. And that's what's been gnawing at me, that it took a badge for the truth to carry weight. They sat in silence for a moment. The hum of cicadas filled the air. Danielle finally spoke. That's why this matters, because if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't push back, then it keeps happening. Quietly. Again and again, Anthony nodded slowly. Then we make it bigger than just us. We tell the story, and we don't stop telling it. Danielle leaned back against the porch rail, her eyes on the flag. The flag stays? She repeated softly, more to herself than to him. The next morning, she drafted a longer message for the neighborhood page. This one wasn't defensive. It was reflective, measured, and written with the weight of the past week behind it. Neighbors, I want to thank those of you who reached out in support. What happened here wasn't just about a sunflower flag. It was about what happens when authority is misused to control people who are simply living their lives. My family is not perfect, but we follow the rules. We respect this community. What we cannot respect is intimidation disguised as order. If you've ever felt pressured into silence, know this: you are not alone. We all deserve to feel safe in our own homes. She ended it with a simple line. The measure of a neighborhood is not how perfect the lawns look, but how fair we are to each other. When she hit post, she knew the HOA would hate it. She knew Gerald would stew in his chair, drafting another carefully worded reminder. But she also knew something had shifted. The silence had cracked. People had seen the truth. And in that moment, Danielle felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because she finally understood the bigger lesson, that silence was never safety, and that speaking out, even against something as absurd, and maybe that's the takeaway here, that real strength isn't found in silence, but in refusing to be made small. Because one day, it won't just be a sunflower flag, it'll be something bigger. And when that day comes, people will remember who spoke up first. So if you're watching this, ask yourself, when someone tries to use power against you, will you bow your head, or will you stand tall? Don't let others write your story for you. Subscribe for more stories that matter.